Thank you. It is wonderful to be back for the final event in our series. A number of years ago, when my radio show was still trying to find its legs, a friend gave me some good advice. He said, "You know, Steve, we don't need more information. We already have plenty of that. What we need is more wisdom." And that really hit home for me. And it's been one of my guiding principles ever since. Although I have to say, trying to dispense wisdom on a weekly radio show is harder than you might think, at least without coming off as being pretentious or sanctimonious or just plain boring. And as the father of two teenagers, I can tell you the same principles apply. I am quite sure I have all kinds of priceless wisdom, but you'd have to convince my kids that they believe that as well. So we're going to talk about wisdom this evening and what it means in our world today and in our own lives. And this is the culmination in our series From Knowledge to Wisdom, The Art of Living. Our first event examined the science of happiness, and the second one looked at the roots of our moral impulses. And now we're going to take a more philosophical turn, although it's philosophy informed by recent insights from psychology and neuroscience. What does it mean to live wisely? What's the connection between wisdom and character? And does a good life always have an ethical dimension, or is it just fine to kick back and enjoy ourselves without feeling compelled to do good? These are big questions, and to me, they seem all the more relevant this year during this very strange presidential campaign season when wisdom seems to be in short supply. Fortunately, we have a wonderful panel to sort out these ideas, so let me introduce our speakers. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a professor of psychology at Northeastern University, where she's director of the Interdisciplinary Affective Science Laboratory. Her research focuses on the nature of emotion from the perspectives of both psychology and neuroscience. She's the author of the forthcoming book, How Emotions Are Made, The New Science of the Mind and Brain, and has edited and contributed to numerous textbooks. Along with James Russell, she's the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Emotion Review. Philip Kitcher is a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. He specializes in the philosophy of science and of mathematics, the philosophy of literature, and more recently, pragmatism. He's the author of 12 books, including The Ethical Project, Living with Darwin, In Mendel's Mirror, Philosophical Reflections on Biology, Science, Truth, and Democracy, The Lives to Come, The Genetic Revolution and Human Possibilities, and more recently, Life After Faith, The Case for Secular Humanism. Valerie Tiberius is a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota. Her work has focused on ethics and moral psychology. Much of her work is centered at the junction of practical philosophy and practical psychology, examining how both disciplines can improve lives. She's published many reviewed papers and book chapters, and she's written 3 books, The Reflective Life, Deliberation About the Good, and Moral Psychology, and she's now working on a new book, Well-Being as Value Fulfillment. Welcome, all of you. So let me explain the format. We will be talking for about close to an hour, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. So Valerie, let me start with you. Philosophers have been debating what wisdom means for centuries. Do you have a working definition?
I do. That's a good thing, since you picked on me first. So I think of wisdom as, I tend to think of all the virtues as fairly complex states, so none of them is going to have a really small definition, so be prepared. But I think of wisdom as the set of dispositions and skills and policies that help us deliberate about what matters in life and then translate that into choices and action. So we can figure out what's good and then achieve those things in our lives, and also, help other people do so too if they're struggling with their deliberating and choices.
Now, Lisa, you come at this from more of a science perspective. Do you have a definition of wisdom?
I think it's very similar to Valerie's in some ways. And what I would say is wisdom isn't one thing. It's not one way of living or one way of applying knowledge. Sometimes wisdom is realizing what you don't know and stepping back from your sense of certainty that you do know. And sometimes wisdom is being very clear about what your goals or values are and using what you know to achieve them. So, one of the basic dilemmas we all face because we're a very social species, and that's one of our greatest adaptive advantages, actually, as a species, is that we rely on each other and we depend on each other, but we have this kind of basic dilemma of when do we favor getting along versus when do we favor getting ahead. There are many ways to talk about that, but wisdom is in part knowing which one you're favoring in the moment and achieving it effectively, I would say.
Well, Philip, let me turn to you. If we try to put this in some historical perspective, I mean, wisdom has been discussed and debated for centuries. I mean, going back to Aristotle at least. Has the meaning of it changed over the centuries? I mean, as philosophers have debated, and more recent philosophers, and David Hume, Ralph Waldo Emerson, does wisdom mean something different now?
I think wisdom meant something very different for Emerson than what it meant for Aristotle, for example. But I actually wanted to preface this by saying that unlike you, Steve, I am not wise. And
I'm not wise either.
And one of the things I'm not wise about is wisdom itself. And so I back away from any attempt to think that there's a clear definition here. I think we can sometimes say of people that they're wise about particular things, even though they're quite foolish about others. And that's different from saying that they know those things. To be wise about something or in a particular area seems to have an overall sense of how that area fits together. There's a kind of wholeness about wisdom that there isn't about scattered pieces of knowledge. That's the way I think about it. And when I use wise, period, it tends to be related to life. And I think many of the things that Lisa and Valerie said are absolutely spot on here, being able to make sense of your life. But it seems to me that right at the core of this is somehow knowing who you are and being able to make decisions in ways that realize what you take to be yourself and what's valuable in that self. And
so to put this in some historical perspective, you said to take two examples. Aristotle had a very different view of wisdom than Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Yes.
How?
Well, Aristotle seems to be much more serious, and Emerson celebrates whimsy. He celebrates kicking over the traces. He celebrates a certain kind of individuality that I think would have horrified Aristotle, actually. So, I mean, they're very, very different. It seems to me that both Lisa and Valerie are aiming at a much more encompassing sense of wisdom, which allows for different kinds of characters and different kinds of people to be wise in rather different ways. And that's what makes me a little bit more hesitant to try to frame a clear, precise, unambiguous definition here.
Yeah, Lisa?
I would actually go a little bit further even and say even how a person is wise varies tremendously from context to context. So oftentimes when we use these words that refer to a mental state or a character, we assume a character trait or characteristic. We assume that there's unity or elemental nature. But these words actually usually refer to entire populations of instances. So, for example, happiness is not one thing. It actually is highly variable. What it feels like, what your body is doing, what your face is doing, what your voice sounds like, it's highly variable from instance to instance in a very situated way, meaning that your brain is trying to optimize for the given situation that you're in. So not only are different people wise in different ways, but you yourself are not an entity. You have a lot of flexibility in what you know, how you use what you know, and coming to grips with that, I think actually is important in realizing a meaningful life.
So it sounds like both of you are saying we might be wise about some things, but stupid about other things. And so maybe it's fallacious thinking to just talk about a wise person in general.
Well, sometimes a wise person realizes what they don't know. I mean, that is a very important source of wisdom, I would say. So, sure, I mean, we're all stupid about some things and wise about others, but I think part of wisdom is knowing what you don't know and really resisting to using your own sense of confidence and certainty as evidence that you are right in some fundamental way.
But isn't there a distinction between wisdom and knowledge? So knowledge might be, we know some stuff, we don't know other things. Wisdom is presumably something deeper, right?
Not necessarily deeper, but it's certainly different in character. That's why I want to go for this notion of wholeness and overall understanding. The wise person somehow knows how all the individual bits of information he or she has, which may not be a larger group than somebody else who's quite foolish, knows how all of that, in a sense, fits, and knows how to deal with it and use it practically in life. So when I set out here this evening, I was really foolish. I didn't realize that the rain would make the subways difficult, so I set out at the time that seemed right, and I hadn't thought, I hadn't reflected, and so I arrived here in a rush, right? Now, that showed a certain kind of inability, a certain falling short on my part, a failure of reflection. Now, Valerie, in her very important book on this, points out something that I think is terribly important, and that is that even the reflective person doesn't reflect all the time. A life in which we constantly reflected on what we were doing and subjected everything that we believed in and were committed to evaluation at every moment would be an intolerable life. So it's not just that you have to have a gift for reflection. You have to know what the important things are to reflect about and when it's important to reflect about them. And so there are lots of different ways in which all of us can fall short of wisdom. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think our lives, anybody's life, is an incredible motley. And that when you look at it, you will find instances and contexts and ways in which they've fallen far short of wisdom. But we still think that some wise people get the whole right and they get the important bits right.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
I want to go back to Aristotle. Because it sounded like we were leading in a direction where we were suggesting there is no one notion of wisdom, it can't be defined, it's too big. And there are some things I agree with about that tendency, but I also think there's a fairly core notion of practical wisdom about action rather than wisdom about, physics or something. That is the same since Aristotle. And it is this idea that wisdom lets you comprehend what is important in life and lets you act in a way that's consistent with that. So that makes it sound like I think there's just one definition of wisdom for everybody, but what I agree with is how that broad definition actually gets instantiated in a person depends tremendously on culture and individual
So
differences
I
and
think
everything else.
that what you're doing, though, is you're making a distinction, which I think is a very valuable one, between process and content. So you're saying there's a process definition. I think we're all actually saying there's a process definition, but not really so much a content. It's not, if you know these 5 things, you're going to be really wise.
But just to go back to Emerson for a moment, I mean, Emerson would have hated your talk of consistency.
Right. He's
That
not
a
in the
foolish
Aristotle
right,
theory.
exactly. I mean, and for him, the ability to be spontaneous, to be whimsical, to go in new directions, to defy the previous unity of your life is something that might be constitutive of a strong character, a good character, a character who is enjoying a valuable and rich life.
That doesn't necessarily sound like wisdom, though. That just sounds like, you know how to live well. You know how to cultivate new experiences.
Well, I'm not an expert on either Aristotle or Emerson, so of course I will just speak with confidence because I have a PhD. That's
But you
what-
actually know stuff.
What I would say is maybe they were both wise in the sense that they clearly had things that were meaningful to them, and they were prioritizing different end states, different goals, and enacting those goals, knowing how to use what you know and realize what you don't in order to get where you want to go is really the key, right? So I think my wisest moments are, to use a friend of mine's phrasing, when I think about future Lisa, not tomorrow, but 70 or 80-year-old Lisa, what What will she be regretful about? What will she feel? Will she look back on her life and feel like, and I know this sounds really esoteric, but I actually do that. I actually try to simulate, what am I going to, if I do this versus that, will I be regretful?
This is a great philosophical test. It goes back to Schopenhauer and to Nietzsche. And they ask, as you approach the end of your life, would you endorse it in the sense of being given the chance to do it all over again? Would you do it the same way? And here too, it seems to me you can raise questions. You can ask whether the view from the end is really the right one.
Sure.
Does that really have priority? You can imagine, we all know of people who lead what appear to be very rich and fulfilling lives, and then in the last weeks or months, they have a crisis of confidence, and they think of themselves as having wasted their lives.
But this is a really fascinating question. I mean, one question is, do we gain more wisdom as we age? I mean, there is sort of this, folk wisdom that, the greatest wisdom comes with age, from an accumulation of life's experiences. Or is wisdom somehow a personality trait? Are some people just born wiser than other people?
I don't think anybody's born wise. And I suspect that some people can attain wisdom at different ages and they can lose it. I suspect that this is not something that is a privilege of the old. I think the old can become very foolish and can lapse from insights and understandings that they had earlier.
Well, if you do think that wisdom requires some cognitive, it's multifaceted, but if you think it requires some cognitive skills and ability to think through things, and if those, well, Lisa can tell us what happens to those kinds of capacities as we age, but they don't always do that well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess though I might say something which will sound incredibly relativistic, and I actually don't mean it that way, but I think when you view wisdom as something you attain and then eventually lose as you age, you diminish, you look at children like they're inferior adults, and you look at old people like they're, inferior young people, and that is a rampant view in science and in our culture, when in fact, you have to think about the fact that you really want to fit between you and your context. So children are wise. They are wise in ways that are different from the ways that adults are wise. And as you age, some things you do lose eventually. Your memory starts to fade, and actually it doesn't happen in old age. It really starts to happen in middle age is actually when the trajectories start to change a little bit. When I started studying elderly people, I was in my late 30s, early 40s, and I said, some of these things like favoring pleasant experiences and avoiding negativity, I'm already experiencing that now. And he was like, I hate to tell you something, but you are middle-aged. I was like, oh, okay, well, I hadn't thought of it that way before. But
so just as an aside, when does memory start to go?
It's different well, this is the interesting thing we were talking about before, that it's different for different people, actually. So we study, some of our elderly subjects who we study, are between the ages of 65 and 80, and their memory looks like a 25-year-old. And their brain looks like, in certain places, like a 25-year-old. There's no statistical difference. So for some people, the progression of not being able to multitask as much, and certain types of memory start to be, like remembering names and details and things start to go. Typically, people start to notice in middle age.
But so to me, that sounds like you're talking about particular cognitive functions.
Yeah,
that doesn't sound like wisdom.
Well, again, I would say if you think about wisdom in a process sense as using what you know, and not necessarily declaratively what you know, that you can, reflection is great, but you can be wise also without reflection. It's using what you know for the purposes of achieving whatever it is you want to achieve in a situation. So newborns are wise in a particular way that most of us as adults wouldn't think of as wisdom, but for them it totally works, right, most of the time. I guess that's sort of how I prefer to think about it. Just like in our culture, we have some things we really value that other cultures, it's not that they don't value those things, it's that they're like completely irrelevant, right? So my team just came back from Tanzania studying the Hadza, who are one of the last hunter-gatherers in Africa. And their entire system of what matters to them is somewhat different from ours. There certainly are some commonalities, but way more differences than you would imagine. So, primitivism was this idea that we had the wisdom and other cultures don't because they don't do what we do. And I think we do this a little bit with age, too.
There's something in what you said that that brought me back to the question of whether wisdom has changed over history, our notion of it. Because the way you put it was, it's these capacities to get what we value or what we need or what we want, and so an infant can have wisdom. And one thing that does seem to be different is Aristotle thought there is a human good. There is a good life. It's the good life for everybody. And wisdom is the set of capacities that help you achieve that thing. And for, you were hesitant about being a relativist, but I think in general, many of us are not as absolutist as Aristotle was about this anymore. But there's still the question of, is wisdom just these capacities to get at whatever goals you happen to have, or are there some kind of, constraints on which goals?
Sure. So, the only reason why I
can
said...
the mob boss be wise,
Yeah, so that's tough because I guess I would say two things. One is, I made that comment about relativism because the moment that you say something is not one thing, some people take you to be meaning it's everything, or in which case it's nothing. But, more than one does not mean everything. It can mean more than one, so some. And you're asking, is it this or is it this? When you ask the question about the mob boss, this is the whole issue of getting along versus getting ahead. Some of us may feel it's immoral to kill someone under any circumstances. Some of us may feel it's immoral under many or most circumstances, but sometimes it's justified. Some people have no, qualms about it. So what you're asking, I think, is a difficult question to answer because your goals, different people vary in how much other people figure into their goals, this whole getting along versus
there's
getting
an
ahead thing.
ethical question here.
Yeah.
By definition, are we saying that a wise person is a good person?
Well, I tend to, I guess, I'm not like wedded to Aristotle, but I am in that tradition when it comes to virtues. So I tend to think wisdom is a virtue word. It's a word we use to praise people and to, when we talk about virtues, those are the things we want to inculcate in our kids and teach students to develop. And so I tend to think Tony Soprano was not wise. He was knowledgeable, and maybe people don't watch, it's an old show, but the first thing that came to my mind was or The Godfather, That's not wisdom, because wisdom does have some connection to ethical goodness. It doesn't have to be as tight and as absolutist as Aristotle's connection, but I think it has to be something ethical.
Yeah.
Philip?
Yeah, I actually have a preliminary point, or rather a question I want to raise. How common is wisdom? My sense is that real wisdom is pretty rare. That it's not something that you can talk about, lots of little children having, or lots of middle-aged people having, or lots of old people having. I think the standards for being wise are pretty demanding, and so I felt a little queasy when I heard you talking about all these sort of nicely adaptive people who were doing who were getting along and getting their goals. I agree with Valerie about two things here. One is that I think that there's a sense that you're not wise if you just know how to get what your goals, if your goals are somehow all askew. And that getting the right goals, or getting even the right goals for you, is an ethical matter. This isn't something that Tony Soprano or the Godfather has. It's actually, I think, quite demanding, and so I think we should start perhaps with the idea of the sage or the saint. And think of those as our examples of wisdom, and then decide how much leeway we want to give to the
Can I
lesser
just-
folk.
And we
I
call it
just-
commercial wisdom.
Follow up on one thing. So I guess what I would say is I wasn't necessarily saying that. I actually agree with Valerie in the sense I actually also understand wisdom in my own life. I wish it were only being wise to be good. But I think, in the Jewish tradition, you can be an atheist and still be a really good Jew because you just ask the question. So I think while my preference is that there's some aspect of morality built into wisdom, I think it's worth being able to talk about the possibility that it isn't. I'm not saying that I personally come down on that side, but sometimes it's worth being able to have a discussion about whether or not Tony Soprano is there are some cultures which are very collectivist, and there are some where any kind of individualism would be considered unwise. But there are also cultures which are even more individualistic than we are as a culture when we're,
Let's play that out a little bit.
Yeah.
So what does wisdom mean if we throw ethics out the window? I mean, what is that?
Can I
there's
interrupt on
Yeah,
that because I was going to say I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a really neat thing to think about. But to talk about that question, we need to. What do you mean by ethical? Because there's Tony Soprano. Okay, he murdered some people, but he also went to a shrink. He was good to his kids. He wasn't the best husband in the world, but he wasn't terrible. Then you have, people who are who are addicted to drugs and are stealing their parents' furniture and money from their friends' wallets, who are throwing their lives away. And you have people who are not saints or sages, but who are doing decently, being good partners to their partners, and parents to their children, and kids to their parents. So where is the line at which we say, well, that's no longer ethical? I guess I'm pretty broad about it, so I tend to think if we're using the word ethical, it's, maybe Tony Soprano's kind of on the cusp, or maybe he's probably over there. I don't remember the show that well.
Yeah.
But lots of us who are not perfect we're still ethical, so we could still achieve wisdom.
What about where does character fit into this? Does wisdom demand that a person have character? And what is character? Is that part of this discussion? Do you care about character?
I mean, I tend to think character is the set of virtues that a person has, and wisdom is one of those virtues. But maybe you mean something else by character.
I throw it out there. It's just it seems like there is a lot of call right now for people with more character. But I don't. Maybe that's a word that really doesn't carry much weight for you.
I'm not sure about it. Let me go back to some of the features of the previous discussion. So suppose we start with some of the great examples of wise people that we can all think of. We might philosophers might think that Socrates was wise, even though he was famously modest about his own cognitive accomplishments. Some of us might think that St. Francis was wise. Some of us might think that Hillel was wise. Okay, so we start off with those examples, but I also think ordinary people can be wise. Just, think about somebody who devotes his or her life to the very serious task of making sure that the people who live around him or her thrive and flourish. And so if she does the deathbed test and she reflects back on her life, she says, I've had this impact on others who will live on after me. I think this is a terribly important feature of our lives, that they should have connections to something bigger than ourselves. Not necessarily something permanent, but to other human lives. And to feel that at the end you have made a positive impact on lots, that your life has been full of that sort of work, is, I think, sufficient for having ethical character, for having wisdom, and for having lived well. So that's really the territory in which I want to situate this. Now, if you've gone around murdering lots of people and conniving at lots of people's murders and gone after material possessions your whole life long and power and abused it, then you're failing at this spectacularly. Most of us, I suspect, fail at it in just a rather more mundane way, that we just don't do that much that's really good and really positive for those around us. So that's the way, I mean, that's more the way I would be inclined to chart this particular topic.
Lisa, is there a neuroscience of wisdom?
I think so. I mean, well, you know, we have a grant actually that has wisdom in the title, so that
So
was
there
a
must
little
be.
bit of marketing, you know, to the granting agency. But yeah, I mean, in the same way as in the theme of, you know, using what you know and realizing what you don't, using what you know to achieve your goals. I mean, I do think that there are ways that you can, depending on how you define wisdom, that there are ways to study how brains and bodies work that are beneficial and not, I'm trying to avoid Cartesian language. It's very hard in English to do this, and especially when you're talking about the brain. But I think it's possible to study the way in which your nervous system works in a beneficial way and in ways that it doesn't, and things that you yourself can do to keep your nervous system functioning well.
I mean, are you talking about, I don't know, positive emotions? Are you
Yeah, so
talking
I'll
about
give
the
you-
capacity for empathy, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I am talking about those things. So I'll give you one example. As people age, it's very well established that as we age, we tend to gravitate to things that will make us feel pleasant, and we tend to divest ourselves of things which are unpleasant. So this is a common strategy that, on average, people tend to do as they get older. And it's a bit of a motivational strategy, meaning you can see in experiments that when you put, for example, you can take glasses like this, which have a little monocle on them, and put them on people, and then you can track where they're looking, for example. And so you can see that as people age, they tend to not even look at things which are going to make them feel unpleasant. But here's the thing. Some of the things that are really good for us are unpleasant. So exercise can feel unpleasant. And I don't mean the kind of exercise where you're hurting yourself, but you start to feel tired and unpleasant when you exercise well before you actually have expended your energy. And people actually often stop exercising earlier than they should because they're using their feeling of unpleasantness as a cue that they need to stop. Or, for example, effort, physical effort, but also mental effort, you know, so when you're involved in a really hard problem trying to solve it, that can actually feel really unpleasant. And as people age, some people start to avoid effortful things because they're unpleasant. That's actually really not good for your brain, and it's also not good for your future memory and attention. If you're one of these people who tends to avoid unpleasant feelings of effort, it's very likely that your memory is going to start to suffer earlier than if you didn't, because that kind of effortful engagement actually keeps your brain healthy. There's a saying in neuroscience, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so atrophy will actually happen sooner for you.
So one of the questions here is whether, to go back to wisdom, whether this is more the product of sort of hard-earned reflection, rational thinking, or is it more something that comes out of our emotional responses?
Can I register a worry? I mean, I think the research you described sounded fantastically interesting. it's not clear to me that it has very much to do with wisdom. I mean, I think the trouble with certain kinds of advertisements for projects in neuroscience at the moment is that people get very excited. They say we're going to study the way in which consciousness relates to the brain, or we're going to understand the neuroscience of wisdom. Whereas, the lessons of biology generally seem to me to go in the direction of find the manageable problem. I mean, in the early 20th century, after the rediscovery of Mendel's ideas, there was a whole movement in genetics that said, let's go and do human medical genetics right away. Let's figure out how human disease works. Well, T.H. Morgan said, let's look at eye color in fruit flies instead. And it was the Morgan tradition that led slowly through what seemed small but well-focused questions, eventually to things like the Human Genome Project and a very serious human medical genetics. And I think the sort of thing you're describing about, trying to figure out how positive, positive emotions might work and the neuroscience that lies behind this, seem to me pretty good individual projects, but there's something mischaracterized about them when you see them already as it were, the neuroscience of wisdom. I think it's going to be a long series of steps before we get to anything that we might think of as the neuroscience of consciousness, or the neuroscience of higher cognitive processes, or the neuroscience of wisdom.
Sure. Well, I don't think I was claiming that I had solved the problem of neuroscience of wisdom. I think I was pretty clear that I used that title to persuade NIH to give me a grant.
Yes.
Part of grants
NIH was persuaded, is what it
they
sounds
were
like.
persuaded, here's what I will say. I actually somewhat disagree with you in the sense that, scientists often overclaim for sure, and there's a difference between, tempting a granting agency and actually stating that you have solved a problem. Everybody recognizes this. Grant applications are advocacy documents for agencies to give you money to do the important work that you want to do. But I will say this, that if you think that decision making is important to make sure that you are being wise, I think that actually what I just told you in very vague terms actually is a piece of the puzzle, because you will not be able to, and part of any decision-making process is not necessarily deliberately. Your brain is estimating what is valuable to you and what isn't, what is going to be rewarding to you and what isn't. This is how your brain goes about doing that is, is currently debated. But your ability to weigh options. There's very good psychological evidence that this is very important to productive decision making. But what we're talking about here is wisdom. And those regions of the brain are hugely important. So it's not so much that you can't be wise as you start to lose your memory. It's just that you're restricted in the way that you make decisions, which means that sometimes you aren't necessarily going to be making the best decisions that you can for yourself.
I have to say, I'm delighted that there's some disagreement here. I thought you were all just going to agree about everything. We're
academics, so we're gonna,
Valerie, do you want to
I was
jump
going to
in?
defend Lisa, which puts me in opposition to Philip at least. So, but because the way I tend to think about these sorts of complex virtues is that they have many parts and they have many sort of necessary causes that underlie your ability to develop any of the more complex traits. So as you said, it's a piece of the puzzle, and the facts about what we need to do to maintain certain kinds of decision-making capacities, it's an important piece of the puzzle. I think that's fair enough for any NIH.
Yeah, thanks. I will say one other thing too, and that is one of the things that these people can do who don't shy away from unpleasant effort, is they understand that feeling unpleasant doesn't mean that something is wrong. This is, a lot of decision making comes down to when you feel good, you tend to interpret that as everything is as it should be, and when you feel bad, that's a signal that you need to change what you're doing. That's a signal that something is wrong. That is a non-tenable position. Sometimes you can feel unpleasant for very good reasons, and sometimes feeling pleasant is actually not optimal. Wise actually. So I guess I haven't talked about what's different about the people who understand that, but some of the greatest mistakes that people make is being led by the belief that feeling good is good and feeling bad means something's bad or wrong, and it's just completely not.
I just want to express my skepticism. I think lots of really good work is going on in neuroscience, but I wish we could do without decades of the brain, years of the brain, neurohype in general. I wish you didn't have to advertise to NIH in the way that you do. Think about it this way. We still don't have a really good, clear picture of the early stages of development in mammals, right? This is something that people are still struggling to do. We have a little bit of understanding of how fruit fly bodies get put together. Now, if you're talking about something as complicated as the human brain and something as complicated as higher cognitive functioning, let alone wisdom, that seems to me orders of magnitude more complicated.
So
it might not turn out to be that way.
What is it you think that we don't know?
I think we're at the very, very beginnings of these sciences with respect to neuroscience. I think we've gotten a bit further down the road with the development of certain kinds of organisms. And I think at this stage, thanks to Morgan and people who are prepared to answer really small, well-focused questions and add the results together, I think in genetics we have a pretty good picture. But that picture has been radically transformed even in the last decade. All the sorts of things that people thought they knew about the genome have turned out to be wrong. It's not static, it's dynamic, etc., etc., etc. It seems to me just prima facie highly implausible to think that neuroscience is somehow going to be able to tackle the most difficult questions about our lives and our psychology within the next decades. I think this is going to be a process that's going to take a very long time, and it's going to take the sort of hard work that obviously has gone into your research, and lots more besides. And to say at the very beginning, well, we're on track for the neuroscience of consciousness or the neuroscience of wisdom, seems to me just misadvertised.
So I think it's interesting. You actually will hold a special place in my heart because you are the first person to ever say that I have engaged in neurohype. I'm usually on the side of criticizing my own field for many things. So I actually that sort of puts me back in the group with my so that makes me feel like I have an identity as a neuroscientist. I have to say,
maybe as I get older, I don't get wiser. I just get grumpier.
But here's what I would say. I agree with you in certain respects, but I think I disagree in others. So we very much understand the development of the fetal brain and the development of the brain in the first 2 years of life. We don't actually know why it happens the way it happens, but the trajectory has been mapped very clearly. I think that's known. I think the problem is that, first of all, like I said, we don't actually completely understand the mechanisms, and that's because, as you well know, in biology, there is more than one way to skin a cat. There's degeneracy, this concept, horrible name, but it basically means there's more than one way to get to an outcome. This means that there's not a one-to-one kind of correspondence. Genetics definitely teaches us that. And a lot of neuroscience still is looking for that, one neuron or one brain region or one network that will correspond to one activity, like thinking versus feeling. There's nothing in the brain that you can point to that says this is a system for thinking and this is a system for feeling. I'm sure you've all read and heard otherwise. But the brain doesn't respect those categories. So sure, I agree with you in some ways, but I do actually think that when you put anatomy together with signal processing from engineering, together with behavioral studies from psychology, we actually do have a pretty good picture of how the brain more or less is working. Not why at a descriptive level.
But isn't the question?
I have to say something. Because I'm thinking of my poor friend Marty Chalfie, who works with C. elegans, and it's got 950 cells, and he's basically trying to figure out how various kinds of sensory systems work in C. elegans. And he doesn't think he's got it.
But
he
he's trying to answer a question at a different level of analysis than I'm talking about.
He's trying to answer, very hard questions so we can get something not just like a rough sort of Rorschach blotty kind of outline of what's going on, but what's going on in sharp and focused detail. And that seems to me to be to have been the message of 20th century biology.
We could go on.
All right.
But I'm going to.
That's where I come from.
Wisdom, actually.
Yeah. Well. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Because one thing that Philip is demanding, and it sounds like Lisa is on board with, is a kind of intellectual humility about what we know and what we don't know. And that was one piece of the puzzle of what wisdom is, if it's a multivarious thing, that Lisa mentioned at the beginning that I was hoping we'd come back to. The idea that part of wisdom is knowing when you don't know. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important. And you mentioned the current political whatever it is.
Shenanigans.
I could not think of a good word for it. That humility is lacking in our culture.
For sure.
In the
for
moment,
sure.
I think.
I think that's right. And actually, one of your colleagues, Stuart
Farstein,
wrote a wonderful, wonderful book.
Ignorance.
This is the best. I wish I had thought of a title like that. That is the best.
The successor is called Failure.
I know, I read it too, actually. So I read both of his books, and but his point in this book is a really important point, and that is one of the most important things that, one of the most important tools that a scientist has is recognizing when you don't know something. Mm-hmm. And when a study fails, that's actually really useful knowledge.
But we don't tend to hear about that. We hear about the studies that have been successful,
right.
But we tend not to hear about the studies if they don't pan out.
I will say one other thing, and that is, you can understand a phenomenon at different levels of analysis, right? So when you want to understand what wisdom is, we can look to philosophy or anthropology or sociology to try answer those questions, and then we can also look at, psychology, or we could look at how neurons fire in patterns, or we can actually look at how, sodium enters and exits cells, or we can look actually at the cell membranes and the physical properties of the cell membranes that allow the neuron to function. I guess my point is I don't prioritize one of those over the other. I think we know something about wisdom at various levels, and there are many things we don't know at various levels. Some people do want to prioritize. We don't really know how things work until we can get to the physics of it, and I just don't. I don't adhere to that view. I think there's something to be learned from actually trying to link those views together.
I want to come back to the question of whether wisdom is something that basically we gain through reflection. I mean, is it sort of a cognitive, a rational process, Valerie?
Well, I think I wrote a book called The Reflective Life. Maybe you can guess my answer, but I certainly think reflection is part of wisdom. But in the book, as Philip kindly mentioned, I also think you can engage in reflection too much or too frequently. To connect it to my current obsession, which is humility, not in the context of science, but actually in the context of friendship, where I think one of the mistakes we make in trying to help other people make decisions is thinking we know what it's like to be them. And I think we do this, maybe I'm, as an older sister, maybe I do it more than other people, but I think people in general assume that the things someone else cares about are the same same things that I care about, and the way you think about things is the same way that I think about things. And I think that if we have that natural tendency, it does take a little bit of reflection at times to overcome that, because you have to create a kind of policy for yourself where you sort of talk yourself down from your lofty sense that you know everything about everything.
So one of the practical pieces of advice here is stop giving so many pieces of advice, suggestions to other people.
Thank you, yes, that is my paradoxical advice. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I want to take up a theme which I think is also something Valerie agrees with, which is that reflection should come in to the well-lived life at various points. I think Aristotle was very much beguiled by the thought that only a very few privileged people, males, highborn, members of the Greek aristocracy, could live well. I certainly don't think that. But I think we've become vulnerable to another thought, which is that it's something that your life is somehow something that you set on course at some moment of decision. You know, you have a moment of what Walter Pater called an epiphany. Joyce took up the term, and so Stephen Dedalus is sort of constantly having these moments when things appear to him. And, you know, it's as though at some point in your late adolescence or your early adulthood, everything comes together. You decide who you are, what you're doing. Then your values, your commitments are all set for the rest of your life, and you go out on your plan. But I don't think it's like that. I think reflection should come in not in some sort of one unique moment of stock taking, but actually throughout your life, as you grow, as you change, as you learn that some of the things that you thought were really important aren't as important as you thought. And it's a reflection that I think, and this goes back to my theme about the importance of our connectedness with others and the things that we do for other people, that really require you constantly to be thinking about how your life is making an impact on other people. And that can be done, as Valerie's just pointed out, from your thinking that you know what's best from them. But it can also be done by your taking on board this, I think, actually quite crucial component in being wise, which is recognizing that they might have a different and distinctive point of view, trying to fathom it, trying to perhaps engage them in conversations about your point of view for them and their point of view for them, and so on and so forth. So all of this, it seems to me, goes into the kind of reflective process through which the wise person who lives well forms values, judgments, plans for the future. And then, if all goes well, at the end, I think you can make this judgment from the late in life perspective, where you see yourself as wanting to do it all again.
I want to go to the audience for questions in just a couple of minutes, but before that, I have a more personal question for each of you. You've all been studying these issues in one way or another. Wisdom, well-being, character, maybe it's through philosophy, maybe it's through psychology and neuroscience, and I'm wondering if that has made any difference to your own life, if you've done anything differently on the basis of what you have learned through your scholarship to, I don't know, to try to become wiser yourself, to do good in the world, whatever it might be. Lisa?
Yeah, I definitely have. I would say you can be knowledgeable about neuroscience, or you can be wise about it, meaning you use it actually. So here are a couple of things. One is, I think I used to be a therapist in another life. That was actually my original training. And I can tell you, I don't think reflection is cognitive. In fact, if it were only cognitive, if it didn't matter to you in some way, you wouldn't even think about it. So I just want to make that clear. But what I would say is that here's one thing that I know, that we don't know why it worked out this way, but it certainly is the case that your brain is not a reactive organ. It doesn't sit dormant until something presents itself to you and then you perceive it and react to it. Your brain is predicting all the time. basically. It's wired that way. All brains are wired that way. Fruit fly brains are wired that way.
So I'm going
to tell
what
you.
does that meant for your
Here's what it
Saul?
means. It means that reflection can sometimes be super costly. Really what you want to have is a brain that predicts well. Predicts meaning, I don't mean like who's going to win the World Series, because we all know it's going to be the Red Sox. It's going to be really, I actually don't even care about baseball. It's an awesome thing to say, though, in New York, right? So, but see, I predicted that would be a joke, and it was. But prediction is in like in 1 minute, in one moment, what is your brain's predicting what your body needs to do next, and so on. So what this means, though, is that you can cultivate experiences for yourself that, because your past is what your brain uses to predict the immediate future and also the long-term future. So if I want to have a brain that's predicting well, I need to cultivate certain types of experiences for myself. This comes directly from Buddhist philosophy. The meditation helps you be mindful, not because it actually changes your ability to make better decisions in the moment. It's that just the practice of meditation changes how your brain predicts.
So do you
basically.
meditate?
I don't meditate. Well, let me just say this, that most Buddhist monks don't meditate, right? Some of them use scholarship as a way of de-reifying the self, of getting outside yourself, right? So that's another piece, I would say, that understanding that the self is social construction, basically, it's social reality, is very helpful. It's helpful to avoid these trappings that, there's a Buddhist saying, anger is a form of ignorance. And really what that means is you have to be able to step outside yourself and see somebody else's point of view, particularly when you probably don't agree with it. I think de-reifying the self, to use the Buddhist term, is a real nugget of wisdom that everybody could use a little bit more of, definitely in this election cycle, for sure.
Let me turn to Valerie. Given your study of these questions of wisdom, character, the reflective life, how does this affect your own life?
Two things I would say. One is, in the reflective life, when I was writing that book, I thought a lot about a virtue that I called perspective. And the idea that I had was not completely original to me, but was that part of living a good life is being able to focus on the things that matter and to let the other stuff go. And so I talked a lot, I thought a lot about, how do you do that, and what are the policies that you can actually adopt to make yourself more likely to pay attention to what matters when it's there, and to not be worried about, to not sweat the small stuff. And that actually, a lot of the psychology literature that I read about reasoning and the way that that explicit reasoning about things and thinking can be harmful to you, that was very helpful to me. In a practical sense, I make much quicker decisions at restaurants, sort of like, that looks good, okay, and then it's fine. The other thing that has made a difference is lately the work I've been doing on humility, because the truth is I am a bossy older sister, and I denied it for a long time, but I think it's true, and working on the idea of the virtue of humility has made me sort of sit back when I'm hearing about someone else's struggles and what they're going through, and think, well, they're different from me and they care about different things, and I need to appreciate that. So that's been helpful too. I'm sure my sisters would agree.
Yeah.
I hope they would.
Philip, what about you at a personal level?
Okay, well, I find this hard because it does seem to me that the things that I've read across a wide variety of fields, not just philosophy, but anthropological studies, historical studies, works of literature, pieces of natural science, have made a difference to the way I think about my own life and the way I live my own life. But these are all tangled up with bits and pieces of my own everyday life, with the ways I interact with my family, with the enormous joys and changes that have come out of my experiences with my own children and now with my grandchildren, out of the interactions that I have with my students, and not necessarily about academic matters at all. So in a certain sense, I want to say it's all a great big hodgepodge. And reading Aristotle, or reading Valery, or reading Thomas Mann, or reading Joyce, or listening to Beethoven, or talking to Marty Chalfie about C. elegans, you know, it all goes into some enormous bundle of spaghetti that protrudes somewhere and pushes me in a new direction. And then I react to that, I get new experiences. And in a certain sense, I don't think of myself as a wise person, but I do think that one thing I have done, and perhaps this is why I emphasize it, is this sort of going back and reflecting again on where I'm going at various points in my life and thinking about it in light of a whole bundle of stuff. But if I had to give any advice to people about thinking about their lives, it would be think broadly, read widely, synthesize, and from time to time reflect on everything, including your most intimate and precious experiences.
Okay, let's go to the audience.
So the first thing that came to mind is that there's a research program in psychology. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I sometimes work with psychologists. And there's a research program that studies research by examining exemplars, people who have it, you know, and looking at, well, what are they like? And people who are wise will not say that they're wise. So it's they have to get other people to nominate the wise people, so that to find them, to study what they're like. So that's, I mean, I think one aspect of your point is that wisdom is not something we tend to self-attribute. And, you know, Philip has said many times that he's not wise, and I think, you know, Lisa and all of us would probably say the same thing. The more general idea about your question, that it's not about achieving a goal, I think there's something right about that, even from the way that I think about wisdom, which is that if you look at it in the philosophical tradition, wisdom would have been a virtue that helps you achieve the good. But the good is not your personal good. It's not making you feel happy. It's living the life of a contributing citizen. So it's the good is a much kind of broader concept than your own personal happiness. And so I think that's an important observation. And, you know, what we say about the details of wisdom these days in the 21st century, it depends a little bit on how much we really can say about the good at this point in history and have everyone agree with us, I think. But I think that is a really important observation.
I mean, one of the things that you rightly pointed out is that we all began from the, as it were, the inside of the individual rather than from the outside. But I wanted to creep towards you when I constantly emphasize the idea that the lives that go well are the ones that make connection with other lives. That seems to me enormously important. And to be wise is to have a sense of whatever your goals are that has the well-being of others and what you can do for their well-being firmly at its center. I think your challenge is a really good one. There is too much, in a certain sense, too much opportunity, too many ways in which each of us can go, too many things we can do. And we have to focus. But that can't be if this perspective is right and my perspective is right, simply our retreat from other people. It must be choosing the ways in which we find our own, as it were, vocation in improving the lives of others. And that requires, it seems to me, reflection and re-reflection, because, you know, the world throws curveballs at you from time, to go back to the baseball metaphor, and you have to change course. But it has to be this other directedness that seems to me at the core of the constant process of reflection and re-reflection. I'm no reductionist. I think, and I think I said early on that wisdom is a matter of trying to find connections and unity and how things all fit together. But the trouble is that if you just think about things in too broad and vague a way without any conception of how the details work, that tends to become loose and vacuous. I was a little bit mean in talking about Rorschach blot pictures, but what we really need is a kind of synthesis. This is an idea actually that is part of the great philosopher Kant's thinking, that to have a genuine, deep understanding of something is to have a conception of how the whole thing hangs together, how it's unified, that can be translated at places into matters of detail. So I suspect your wisdom came about because you elevated your perspective from just simply looking at the bits and pieces of the details, but you had that detailed knowledge which could then figure in building a more articulated general picture rather than something vague. And it does seem to me that systems thinking in biology and elsewhere and in life is very important. Thank you.
One of the ways that Aristotle's view about wisdom gets described is very much like what you're suggesting. And the picture is, it's the ideal of wisdom. Few of us probably achieve it, but the ideal is that wisdom is a kind of perceptual capacity that allows you to see the truth about what the right thing to do is or what the good choice is. And if you are truly wise, when you see it, everything else falls away, not just the bad options, but also your motivation to take any of the wrong options. So the wise person has this kind of, it is likened to a perceptual capacity, which also draws them to do the right thing. And I think that's a very compelling picture. In my own work, I've been very concerned about how all of us imperfect, not, perceptually defective people are going to get better at making choices. So I haven't tended to think so much about what the ideal is, but I think that is a very beautiful picture of the ideal of wisdom.
Yeah, I think perhaps we should aspire, the wise must aspire to know the truth. The wise must have a certain kind of intellectual honesty and integrity. A willingness to say when they don't know things, also a commitment to trying to remedy ignorance in areas where it seems crucial. But I want to say a little bit about the simplicity idea. As you were talking, I was reminded of the end of a truly great poem by T.S. Eliot. I don't know whether you know it, Little Gidding. It's the fourth of Eliot's 4 quartets, where he talks at the end of a homecoming, a return to a place where we have found ourselves and where we are, as it were, completely fulfilled. And there are 2 lines that come in this passage where he says, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And I think that's an extraordinary conjuring up of what seems to me the idea of return, fulfillment, coming home, finding wisdom, and its connection with simplicity. So I think there's something deeply right about what you were suggesting.
Philosophers don't tend to give advice to parents about how to raise their children. And I think there are actually a lot of psychologists who are working on the cultivation of character who are probably better positioned to do that. But so let me just say, I'm actually working on a grant project with a couple of psychologists, one of whom is a developmental psychologist, where we're looking at the relationship between people's goals and their character development, where goals are understood very broadly to include goals they have for improving the lives of other people, goals they have such as being a good friend or being a good student in school or being a good kid or cleaning their room or whatever. And the prediction is, and there's some reason to think that this is true, there's one aspect of character that's kind of genetically fixed. And then there's another part of character that you can change or bend or modify with the actions that you take. If children are, so now I'm kind of speculating, but you asked, and you asked assertively, so I'll give it a try. If children were encouraged to adopt goals and to actually engage in the kind of reflection that children are capable of doing, just sort of thinking, well, this goal is important to me. I think a kid can do that. Our prediction is that kind of reflective goal-setting exercise will modify what's called characteristic adaptations. That's the aspect of character that's movable. Traits are not so movable, but characteristic adaptations are movable. And so the thought is that doing these reflective goal-setting exercises will change people's character. There's a lot of evidence that these kinds of goal-setting exercises improve other kinds of outcomes. So college students who do goal-setting exercises end up with higher GPAs, lower dropout rates, and such. So that's kind of the best I can do from the point of view of a philosopher, and I'll let you know what happens after the project is completed.
Lisa?
Yeah, I would take a bit of a different approach, and I guess maybe picking up on a theme that we've talked about here in terms of how we affect each other. One of the things we know from various levels of analysis is that a human can be the most helpful to another human or the most stressful thing. You want to stress somebody in under 5 minutes, you just stick them in a room with someone who might be evaluating them negatively, but it's not really clear. If you do that, you can get a huge response that would take me a half an hour of showing people negative pictures. I can get it in under 5 minutes and really quite robustly. I think one thing that kids don't really understand, and I say this as a parent of one teenager, and I'm actually not speaking of my daughter in this case, but her peers, that one thing kids don't understand, actually, I'm really quite serious. I actually think there's a really serious problem in high schools and middle schools that children aren't learning that they actually have an impact on each other. I mean, we are a social species. We regulate each other's nervous systems. We don't do it necessarily always with pheromones and, our words actually matter. Words matter, not just actions, but actually words. There's a neuroscience explanation for that when you look at the wiring, but I think we often don't really understand that. So think about the life of a teenager. They watch television, they watch sitcoms where meanness, almost to the point of bullying, is actually paired with a laugh track. And then they actually talk to each other like that. Or they listen to lyrics. I like hip hop, but there's some of the lyrics that, I learned to like it. I have a daughter, so, who's 17, but some of those lyrics they're not, I'm not even talking about the offensive lyrics. I'm talking about the ambiguous lyrics, right? So people now in schools girls will walk up to each other and refer to each other like, hey, bitch, because that's actually a common way. What does that mean? Does that mean that this person likes me? Does that mean that that person is swearing at me? Like, what is I could probably list 10 or 15 things that students do to each other to cultivate what in other ways we would talk about as hostile environment, actually, that is wreaking havoc with their nervous systems. It's not a mistake that, we have an opioid crisis in the United States. Partly it's because we haven't taught our children that how they act towards each other, what they say to each other, really, really matters. We have it, I'm all jokes aside about the political debates. We have politicians who think it's okay to say things that it's not just that you would find it offensive, is that it's harmful. It's literally harmful. If you want to hurt somebody, you can punch them, or you can just really be mean to them on a consistent basis, and eventually they will get physically ill. I think teenagers don't fundamentally understand this. So if you want to cultivate wisdom, I think it comes back to understanding that we affect each other. We evolved that way, but our greatest capacities, the ability to really soothe each other and help each other, also puts us, potentially at risk when we don't treat each other with respect. And you can disagree with someone, but having a basic fundamental respect for each other, I just think that's, not taught enough. And it turns out that when you teach your kids those things and you actually give them tools to behave that way, including concepts and words, so just even you expand a student's vocabulary about mental state words in this culture, it doesn't just improve their behavior, it improves their test scores in math and science. It improves their ability to regulate, to set goals. It improves all sorts of things that you would imagine, why, it seems really puzzling about why it would matter until you look at the brain. You look at the structure of the brain. I'm not even talking about function, just look at the wiring. It's obvious that this is something we should be doing that we're not, as a society, we're just not doing it well enough.
We could go on, but we are out of time. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience, and thanks to our panelists.